Hello, I'm Dr. Matt McDornan. I'm a psychiatrist in private practice.
And I'm Dr. Greg Pearson, also a psychiatrist in private practice. Thanks for joining us.
Today we're going to talk about behavioural activation, the B bit of CBT. And I know it might sound a little strange to dissect out the different letters, but this is definitely a topic worthy of examination and review within a treatment program.
So Matt, in earlier videos we did touch briefly on behaviourism as one of the early psychological movements, particularly in shaping behaviour. Its impact on mood, I think, was a more recent.
Well, yeah, there's been, dating back to the 70s, people who've come up with behavioural models of depression, and I guess that's a good place to start in this.
Yeah.
And that is that essentially they run like this: that if you are depressed, there's all sorts of different avoidances that are recruited, along with this notion of anhedonia, the inability to access pleasure, that come together, and along with, I guess, the other third thing, motivation, all drive someone into a place of isolation.
That's right, Matt, and you know, that isolation actually forms a sort of important part of depression, I think. I often, when I think about illnesses, I like to reflect on what their origins might be, and we've seen a lot of information recently about the inflammatory aspect of depression. So when I tend to think about that withdrawal, I think about the experience of being sick, and the necessity to stay in bed and withdraw from social contact as an inherent part of physical illness.
That's right.
But this largely being not as a result of the infection, but as the body's response to infection, both to preserve our energy and let us fight infection, but also to withdraw from social contact so we don't spread it. And we know now that depression has an inflammatory component, so we see similar sort of what are called inflammatory cytokines circulating in depression. So it's almost as though our body is telling us to preserve our energy and withdraw.
It's sort of like an evolutionary perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
I think it's useful to think about, you know, the components of why someone does as well, that apply to some kind of therapy in behaviour activation, because there are some parts of this that we can look at and then challenge. Absolutely. So, you know, one of the common things that people do is, like you say, lie down. It is a hibernative state to be depressed, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, that's probably the other evolutionary model, is hibernation and seasonal variation.
Yes.
So yes, it's a natural inclination.
Driven by problems with motivation.
Loss of motivation, loss of energy.
Pleasure.
Loss of pleasure, yeah.
And then also the attribution of discomfort to various environmental things and then avoiding it.
Yeah.
So these things all come together to shut someone down, and they isolate. And the problem is that once you begin to isolate, whether it's evolutionary processes or lack of pleasure or problems with motivation or avoidance of discomfort things, then you're on what I suppose we call a positive feedback loop. It's self-fulfilling, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, and self-promoting.
Yes.
And I can't remember the study at all, but the name of the study, but there was a study done interviewing people who weren't depressed, and they were asked what would they do if they became depressed, how would they manage their depression? And almost universally they said they would try to exercise, they would try to talk to people or someone, they would socialise and drink, they would work less, that's right, and drink less alcohol. They were the 4 universal responses. when depressed people were interviewed and were asked how they managed their depression, almost universally they said the opposite.
Yes.
That in fact they stopped socialising, that they drank more alcohol, they stopped exercising, and they worked harder.
Yes.
In an effort to sort of validate themselves. And it's that juxtaposition really illustrates how at a behavioural level there's an opportunity to intervene in depression. And this is really what we're talking about today.
That's right. So how do we begin that intervention?
It's hard, isn't it? Really hard. So we need to promote the idea that when you're depressed, the thought of doing something is an awful lot worse than the act of doing something. So we know that when people do engage in activity, having applied some sort of depressive cognitive distortion to that activity, that they derive a greater sense of achievement or pleasure from that activity than they anticipated.
That's right. Yes. And again, there's a scaling of this behavioural activation. So I suppose what we're proposing at one end is you need to build the stage to be exposed to pleasurable events anyway.
Yep, absolutely.
So the starting point is really to have very simple pleasurable activities prescribed. If you can't even begin the activity, then there's less opportunity to really enhance joy, to appreciate things. And I know in hospital here we tend to use leave like this. So I'm very interested in people coming back from their morning walk, and I always ask them what that was like. I know I'm on the right track when someone says to me, it was a really beautiful morning down the beach, the water was clear, and the birds were out. That we're on the right path there. Other people will not, if they're in the throes of depression, not describe their environment or their relationship with the environment or pleasurable things like that.
No, that's right. And the typical description is, some people would say they couldn't even see the beauty.
Yes.
Normally there's someone who loves the beach and loves nature, but it didn't look beautiful to them at all. Or that despite there being beauty there and they could see it was a lovely day, it disappointingly didn't give them any lift in mood or any experience that was pleasurable.
So it's been long observed that is effective to raise mood. I suppose that the behavioural activation part of this is making it much more objective. So there's a couple of things we need to tease out. One is that it's almost like when we talked about the thought diary. It's very useful to do these behaviours and then describe how you felt. We want to collect information about someone's internal experience.
Yeah, totally, man. The nature or the prospect of just engaging in activity unmeasured, although it may be helpful, is not as helpful as some reflection on what the person thought it was going to be like, and then how much pleasure, achievement, mastery they derived from the activity. So that measurement part of a behavioural activation becomes a very, very important thing. We need to demonstrate to ourselves that these are helpful activities.
That's right.
And so by putting these on page, similar to a thought diary, then we begin to see the evidence.
We can teach people to measure their mood before and after an activity. And I suppose the other point is that these are often graded activities. So it's not wise to ask someone to do something that's beyond their reach. Often we talk about generating a whole series of activities and then rating them from something that might be achievable through to something that might be a little harder, and start at the easier end and then foster a sense of, in some ways, mastery. We don't want to set the bar too high, and then you can imagine what might happen to someone's thinking world if they can't do something.
Yeah, That's right. It
That's-
can't be beyond the person.
That's the other trick, isn't it?
That's right. And of course, it has to be achievable. And initially, we should focus on pleasurable activities.
Yeah, so maybe I'll give an example again of someone I saw recently who, this might be easier to understand if we talk about this. A young woman was depressed in my care, and she has a nice relationship with her boyfriend. They're both into rock music. He bought a ticket to a concert, and the concert was several weeks away. But she'd really only just begun her treatment for depression, and she was coming from a place where she'd remained really socially isolated, and she'd stopped her work as a kindergarten teacher. She couldn't really face work colleagues or friends or even some members of her own family. Her well-meaning boyfriend had, thought that this was something that would prompt her referencing her past loves, which were of course submerged under this depression. But you can imagine how threatening that might be to someone who's depressed. The idea of that kind of stimulus, that kind of...
Well, exactly. I mean, it's a great illustration for a number of reasons. One is at face value, a substantially generous and potentially greatly rewarding activity.
Yes.
But on the other hand, it's a complex thing socially and very demanding of someone who's in a depressive situation.
And ultimately threatening, and this woman felt it was way beyond her sense of self and mastery. And then, of course, it folds back into, I don't deserve it, I'm hopeless, and so on. So
I'm ungrateful.
Yes, all of those, things we've talked about before.
And Matt, I'd love to counter that with a situation I encountered recently. A middle-aged woman who's been very depressed for several years, actually, and has had a very difficult depression to treat, and finally went on Parnate. This is an old medicine. She was very nervous about doing it. And for a long time, this woman had wanted to do a sort of a spiritual retreat, I guess, in Bali. And at various times she'd considered doing it, and I had suggested to her that she perhaps wasn't quite well enough, and she was nervous about it as well. But I saw her the other day, and having started this medicine, she's begun to improve. And with the encouragement of her husband, she decided to attend this retreat. And the timing to me just seemed perfect. If she'd done it 6 or 12 months ago, then I don't think she was in a position to derive the growth and positivity of the experience that she was going to have. But the timing of this is just perfect, and she's on the improve, and I know this is going to be a really validating experience for her.
Yes.
It's a very complex task, but it's an illustration of timing, really, when to do it. So initially we start with very simple activities, and I can still remember attending a workshop at the APA in the United States and watching Michael Thays do cognitive therapy with severely depressed people was the workshop. And one of his colleagues did a wonderful job of being this incredibly depressed person, and they talked at length about a singular activity that this man could do that may make him feel better by the end of the day, and that was making a phone call to an old friend, and someone he knew very well, felt very comfortable with, was fully across his illness. And it was a really lovely experience to watch that unfold. So that may be a starting point, just reaching out, listening to music, some sort of...
And I think the other scenario that comes up often is coaching family members around these themes and these aspects of depression, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
So well-meaning family members sometimes think it's through structure or activities that someone's depression will be lifted. It has to be considered, because returning to work early or complicated social engagements may work if the timing's right, as you say, Greg, but may not.
Yes, the best intentions can sometimes backfire
Yes.
if they're delivered at the wrong time.
Yes.
And you know, the rock concert issue was a beautiful illustration of
Yes.
that. You know,
Yes.
it's a lovely gesture, but it may be inappropriate at that point in time.
Yes.
But ultimately, this gets expanded to the point where we have an activity schedule that someone may be able to keep. And this is really like a timetable for the week, where people might fill in appointments and favourite television shows and meal times, and then look to fill up their day with other activities, a mixture of pleasure-oriented activities and then achievement-based activities. Because when someone's depressed, waking up in the morning with a day stretching ahead of them with absolutely no structure or plan can be really overwhelming.
Absolutely.
And but a simple structure to that day can make the day seem a lot more achievable.
Yes.
And if that process can become positive, then we begin to ignite a process of recovery, and that's ideally what we want to do.
I often talk to patients about, it sounds a little obtuse, but the myth of Sisyphus. So this was a paper written by Albert Camus, and Sisyphus was a figure in Greek mythology who committed a crime, and for his sins as a demigod, he was given the punishment of rolling a boulder up a hill and then letting the boulder go and then watching it go back down and trudging back down the hill ad into infinitum. So that was his punishment. And Albert Camus was really only interested in one part of the story, and that was what was in the mind of Sisyphus when he let the boulder go at the top and he realised it was all happening again. And in a way, that's how my depressed patients describe waking up. It's this, I'm here again, a featureless day. I have to, and often they talk about, I have to just get through to sleep, the next sleep. It's really, can one imagine if you weren't able to access motivation or pleasure along with all of the complicated thinking patterns of depression, what a day might be like. It's a very barren experience, and so the planting things to do and challenging avoidance gently is the idea. And it sounds simple, but it stands up in research, doesn't it, Greg?
Absolutely, yes. And the other curious thing about depression, it's interesting, the Sisyphus metaphor, is that often people's mood improves during the day.
That's right.
And so by evening time, they can anticipate the next day with some optimism. It's almost as though they've rolled the boulder to the top of the hill and it's sitting there. They've achieved what they needed to achieve. But when they wake up in the morning, the boulder has rolled down all by itself, and there's this terrible mood in the morning.
Is it worth activity scheduling later in the day?
Well, that's a really, really good point. Absolutely, if the person is too depressed to do activities later in the day. Conversely, I have a number of patients who describe the fact that if they can initiate the day, if they can get themselves out of bed and engage in something, then often the day rolls on much better. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword with that one.
It's true, isn't it? That morning period it's either avoidance
Make
or not.
Or break, yeah.
I remember a sailor who said that the admiral was absolutely adamant that everyone on the ship got up and made their bed and did this and got dressed. It was a discipline that followed him throughout his life, this admiral on one of the Navy boats, and he'd applied that to his depression.
That level of discipline could be a great
was challenging that avoidance in the morning because he knew that he could pull the sheets up and then that would colour the rest of the day too.
Yeah. Well, a lovely illustration of something we were talking about earlier regarding temperament, character, life events, and how you respond to depression.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much.